Welcome back, everybody. This week we're working on portrait drawing. So we're going to use what we looked at last week with head construction, and we're just going to apply that to a head or a face of our choosing. So it could be a self-portrait. For this video, I'm going to be drawing Mark. Mark is an ocean lifeguard. He's got a great head for drawing with lots of subtle plane changes, really good light in this. So keep your head construction notes nearby. They're going to be really helpful in laying out the planes of the head. So we're going to look at the planes of the head in the simplest way possible first, and then we're going to add in smaller, more complex forms on top of those to start building out the features of the face. We have to pay attention to the features of the face as they're built with these simple forms, but also in how they relate to each other. So I'll talk about that throughout the demo. So I'm starting off with some simple straight line construction, trying to get an envelope shape here, getting everything in the right spot, paying attention to the negative space, and some important landmarks. Looks like the edge of the brow lines up with the middle of the picture plane there. And even though this demo is a little sped up, you can see the first marks I'm making here, the first things that I'm paying attention to are the line of the brow, like the arc of the brow across the front of the head, the base of the nose, which should be halfway from the brow to the chin, and then lining that up with the top and bottom of the ear. So they don't line up perfectly with the ear. The ear is a little bit higher, which tells me the head is tilted down towards us a little bit. And I'm paying attention to the line of the shoulders and how they relate to the pit of the neck. What I call the pit of the neck is that little bit of negative space between the two collarbones. So you have one too if you want to look in the mirror and try and find that spot between your two collarbones at the base of your neck. That tells us a lot about how the head relates to the neck, and the neck to the shoulders, and the shoulders to the torso. So it's an important landmark and worth paying attention to. And that too also happens to line up more or less in the middle of our picture plane of that vertical halfway line. So I'm looking at negative space here, trying to go general to specific. There's a lot to pay attention to in the portrait. Again, we're going to start from the underlying forms, trying to understand what the skull looks like and going from the inside out. Here I'm working on that sphere for the mouth and how that overlaps with that round form of the chin. Before I pay attention to anything going on with the lips or with the eyes and the eyelids or the nostrils, all those small details we see on the surface, they have to be built on top of strong and simple and well understood structures beneath them. Before we draw the eye, we have to draw the eye socket. Before we draw the lips, we have to draw the whole mouth as a simple shape. And before we draw the face, we have to draw the whole head. Then we want to try and capture the likeness, or the getting this to look like the person we want it to. We want that to be present early on in the drawing with these simple construction concepts. We want the planes of the head to look like the person that we're drawing. If they don't, you can see I just erased the mouth to try again. If it doesn't look accurate at this stage, making it more detailed or complex or have more contrast and deeper shadows, whatever, putting more stuff in isn't going to make it more accurate. It's just going to make it more complicated. In fact, it'll make it a lot harder to fix because there'll be just more pieces to move around. So aim for that accuracy early on in the drawing. Remember that a simple drawing is a flexible drawing. So this early stage, We want to move methodically, but we want to stay loose and not too attached to anything. So stay flexible. Keep just checking in with different landmarks. All of those horizontal and vertical alignments are still really important to pay attention to. I'm constantly looking left and right and up and down just to line things up in the right spot as I draw them. Even if you don't see me measuring, I'm constantly measuring just by looking and comparing. So I'm starting to put down like a simple light midtone for the shadows. I spent a lot of time mapping out the shapes of the shadows and using those shadow shapes not really to render the drawing, but just to understand the forms of all these features a little bit better, and the way a form shadow or a cast shadow might be wrapping around one of these landmarks tells me a lot about where that landmark is, how it might stand out away from the face or be recessed into the face. The shadow tells us a lot about that. We can tell pretty clearly where the light's coming from based on that cast shadow below the chin and that shadow that wraps around the neck. The light's coming from above and to the right. So we can make that assumption for the whole drawing. That tells us a lot about all these features. Then I'm using the brush to spread that tone around, diffusing all of the edges, and then using an eraser to carve out those light shapes. This is kind of like a reset button on the drawing. It's a really good opportunity to just check in with everything, double, triple check the drawing and all those proportions and make sure things are in the right spot. A pretty safe assumption we can make throughout like most of the process really is that there's going to be mistakes in here. So if we're preemptive about that, if we're assuming that there are some mistakes, we can create opportunities to fix them, and that's built into the process. So here I'm like sort of reclaiming the drawing, just moving around, just checking in with the pencil, not adding a whole lot of information, but just starting to get a little bit more certain. But even still, I don't really trust the certainty of any of this. It could all change at any moment. So the more open you are to that, the more unattached you are to the small details, the faster your drawing is going to get more accurate. And just over time, you'll spend less time chasing stuff. If you feel like you're spinning your wheels trying to get something to look right, and you're looking more deeply, getting more detailed, and it still looks a little off, it may not be that thing. Sometimes you're working on the eye or the nose or the mouth, and something's off, and it turns out the ear is in the wrong spot. So if you're stuck in that cycle, definitely recommend putting your pencil down and just like walking around looking at something different. You can see here I just moved the ear over quite a bit. It was kind of drifting out towards the back of the head. The ear's something we don't pay a lot of attention to, but it's such a great landmark for telling us about the side plane of the head, the back of the skull, and how the side of the head relates to the front of the head. Just like we practiced with knowing that the ear lines up with the top of the brow and the base of the nose. The ear tells us a lot, but we don't weigh it with a lot of meaning. When we're talking to someone, we don't stare at their ears. As far as I know, I don't stare at someone's ears when I'm talking to them. I look in their eyes. So what's so tricky about drawing portraits is that we want to spend time on the things that we weigh a lot of meaning. So much of what we've evolved for as social creatures is to like read into all of these micro expressions and really subtle body language of the face, usually in the eyes, in the mouth, and how all those features relate to each other. It's a lot easier to draw a tree or a rock or any inanimate object because we haven't evolved to read into the micro expressions of a tree. So when we draw a tree and it looks back at us from the paper, it doesn't seem totally off if we don't get it 100% right. But when we draw a human face, looking at a person's face is like reading a long, complex novel in a fraction of a second. So it's a lot to handle, it's a lot to juggle, and we want to dive into what we're seeing between the eyelids and make the pupils darker and find the like twinkle in the eye and all those things we associate with what makes that person them. So it's hard to make a habit out of detaching from that and treating the head as more of an object. It sounds kind of weird, but most of the likeness lives in the structure of the skull. So look for those hard landmarks of like the eye socket and the bridge of the nose and how they connect across that brow ridge, how that relates to the ear. Again, we don't pay a lot of attention to the ear because it's off on the side of the head. So the ear tends to drift around when we draw portraits. Make sure your ear is not attached to the side of the cheekbone or on the back of the skull somewhere, but just right in its perfect spot on that side plane of the head. And that'll tell us a lot about that arc of the cheekbone and how that comes down and joins with the chin. So the way I've like learned to draw portraits is partly through like underplaying those really expressive features like the eyes or the mouth, and then really focusing in on those features that are a little more under the radar but really important to the likeness, like those planes of the eye socket, how they relate to the cheek, seeing the mouth as that larger spherical shape and how that relates to the chin, all those forms. You'll remember from last week when we drew the planes of the skull, how round the mouth is, even without the like flesh and the skin of the lips, but just the teeth and the bones themselves. I'm starting to commit a little more to the edges of these shadows and that exchange between light and dark, whether it's turning more slowly or if it's more of a fast, abrupt switch from light or dark, whether it's a plane change or a cast shadow or a combination of all those. We want to pay attention to what's directly in the light and what's in the shadow. Even though there's light in the shadows, there's a lot of reflected light, especially at the beach. The bright sand is just acting like a mirror for the sun and just reflecting it, throwing a ton of light up into the shadows, which I think is good for us. It's good for a portrait like this. There's plenty to explore. So there's lots of light and dark in the light shapes. There's a lot of light and dark in the shadow shapes. For now, I'm still focusing on that dividing line of the core shadow, going from light to dark and using that to describe the form of these features. Once that is pretty solid, then I can go in and find that variation in the values in the light and shadow. So I've done this in previous drawings, but I'm looking at the edges of the shadows and occasionally using a dark line to show that it's a sharper edge. So it's a combination of using just tone and shape and using some darker, heavier lines here and there. I'm thinking about the design of the shadow shapes and how I can express that. Like looking at the reference, whatever it might be, and squinting really helps me. It gets rid of a lot of the noise and the different textures. And so thinking about that cast shadow across the collarbone and how that kind of wraps around the neck and up towards the ear, I'm trying to use that as a compositional element, bringing me up towards the portrait. So the line is an effective way to use that. You can see here on this like triangle shaped shadow near the armpit, I'm pushing that sense of line a little bit. That's not required in any way. It's just a way of exploring the differences in all of the different kinds of edges, especially here on the ear. If you look really closely at the ear, you'll see lots of different kinds of edges within those shapes And then just like where we started, I'm still aiming for simple but accurate. There's still plenty of room to get much darker, especially here in the eyes. There's like really dark eyebrows with dark eyes and eyelashes under them, almost behind the eyebrows. The eyebrows come so far forward. So I'm still just like inching up towards the darker shadows. Still trying to make sure everything's in the right spot. And this is just like it's a pretty methodical and careful way to make a portrait. We could try and be more loose and expressive, and maybe we would capture a little bit more life in the drawing, but we'd probably sacrifice some of the accuracy. So it's a trade off. We could spend 12 hours just on the planes of the head and getting the construction right, or we could spend 12 seconds. It's whatever time we have, whatever works for you. If you're working from life, then you're not really in control of your model and how much time they might have. Doing a self portrait is one of the best ways to draw a portrait because your model is always available. If you are working from life, whether it's a self portrait or from a model who's agreed to sit for the portrait, make sure you pay attention to the lighting. So I mentioned earlier the light source here is just the sun. You can see from the shadows that it's coming from above and a little bit to the right, but it's very clear and direct. It's just a single light source. The secondary light source would be the ground, just with all of the reflected light coming from all around, reflecting back up into the shadows. But pay attention to your lights. If it's fluorescent light or if there's multiple light bulbs, maybe there's a light inside and a window, it might create two sets of shadows. It might be hard to tell where the light begins and ends. If it's a cloudy, foggy day, it can be really difficult. So pay attention to your light source. So starting to carve out some darker and sharper landmarks here. I tend to treat that exchange between light and dark as a thing in itself as much as one of the features of the face here. Ultimately, what we're drawing here is not the nose or the eye or the mouth, but the way the light affects them and joins them into one unified face. So that's a way to help draw not just the features themselves, but how they all relate to each other, is how the light and shadow unify them. So make sure you keep stepping back and looking at the big picture. If you're drawing too detailed with your face too close to the paper, you could end up with a collection of really well-drawn features that don't add up to the right face. Keep stepping back and looking at this head as a whole unit. And don't underestimate how it connects to the neck and shoulders too. We haven't talked too much about the figure in this class, but we want to make sure this head is attached to a body. Using a darker pencil now. As I start to commit to these details and get more specific, think about how specific you can be about the focal point of a drawing. The focal point doesn't have to be just the face. It can be a specific piece of a specific shadow that wraps around a specific part of a feature. So think about how small you can aim. This whole drawing could just be a setup to just one single light and shadow exchange. And the whole drawing can sort of like swing or pivot around that. All that connective tissue of the whole picture for the sake of one little moment. This last section, I don't have the video sped up. This is at a normal speed, just because I wanted to show that as I get towards the end of a drawing, and there's still plenty I could do here. I could work on this another couple of hours, but I can't. But I wanted to show that at the end of a drawing, I'm going to slow down and really think about what this drawing needs. I'm looking less and less at the reference and more at just the drawing on its own as like a separate object from the photo and the person I'm drawing, and just an object in its own right. Thinking about what this picture needs. There's still plenty I could do here, but the pattern of any drawing or painting I make feels like the first 80% is like driving on the highway, moving pretty fast and methodical. The next 15% is moving slower, like four-wheel drive on a dirt road maybe. And then the last 5% is like getting out of the car and walking on a small trail. being really thoughtful about every step I take. Not to say that I'm not paying attention for that first 80%. In fact, the first minute or so of the drawing, I'm paying attention a lot to what this drawing is for and what it's about. The first few moments of the drawing should feel pretty similar to the last few moments of like, what am I trying to communicate here? So I do pay attention to that, but a lot of that middle chunk of this whole process is sort of like playtime and just trying stuff out and experimenting. But my point is, at this stage when I'm trying to really finish this piece and maybe never work on it again, I'm paying attention to the drawing itself and not trying so much to copy the photo. I'll still reference it, but I'm asking myself, what does this picture need from me right now before I walk away? What can I do with the time that I have? Time's always going to be a limited resource, and I think that's helpful in a way. It kind of forces us to make moves. So I hope today was helpful. I hope portrait drawing is less scary than it was before. I hope it's not more scary. Challenge yourself with a self-portrait. And the more you practice this, the easier it's going to get. If this is your first time drawing a portrait and it was really hard, don't get discouraged. The more you do this, the easier it's going to be. Just pay attention to those underlying forms from last week. And the more work you put in the beginning, the easier it's going to be for this last 5% or so. Don't try and finish the drawing in the beginning.